Hey everyone, we're here with Suyash Raiborde, an associate at a law firm up in New York City. We're going to dive into more of the details on his background and what he's currently doing. But first, just want to mention that Suyash and I actually met in Greenville about 2 years ago at a networking event and have managed to stay friends ever since, even after he moved up to New York. So I'm lucky that we've managed to stay friends, and I'm really excited to have him on the YoPro Know today. So Suyash, welcome. Give us a brief background on who you are, what you've been doing, and then we'll dive into the details.
Awesome. Thanks, Camber. So as Camber mentioned, my name is Suyash Raiborde. I'm an associate in New York City at a law firm. And basically how I came to be where I am is an interesting story. Some of it is by design. Some of it is kind of how the cards fell. But when I was in undergrad, and I went to North Greenville University in Greenville, South Carolina for my undergrad. And while I was here, I started to think about, okay, what are my career options? What do I really want to pursue? And I started to think about law a little bit more. I started interning with a law firm and kind of understood a little bit of the ins and outs of, okay, what does it mean to work at a law firm and things of that nature. And then as I started to dig into it more, I realized, okay, there's an LSAT exam that I need to take, and there's a bar exam on the back end of all of this. And, you know, it had to be kind of the design part of it was that where I had to make a conscious decision of, okay, I want to ultimately do this and commit 3 years of my life, study for the bar, and, you know, be an attorney. So that was kind of the design part of it. The default part of it, if you will, was more of a, you know, you take the exam and then you apply, and fingers crossed, hope you get into a school that you really want to go to. And unlike maybe some other professions, the legal profession, your career prospects really kind of hinge a little bit on where you end up going to school. And so if you're interested in maybe being in a big city like New York or Chicago or LA, it makes sense to go to maybe a more well-known school versus if you're wanting to stay in a more regional area like South Carolina, you could go to the University of South Carolina or Tennessee. I was fortunate to get into Emory Law in Atlanta, and it was a really good experience there. Emory, when I went, was, I would say, a top 25 school in the country, if I'm remembering my rankings correctly. And that allowed me some opportunities to go to different geographic markets. So when I finished law school, I worked for 2 years in Greenville, South Carolina for a law firm called Haynesworth Sinclair Boyd. And it was a really good experience, almost 2.5 years, and that's where I met Camber. But I wanted to explore a few more opportunities in a larger market, working on different types of deals. And so I started thinking about, okay, what would it be like to be in a city like New York, and how can I kind of strategize to get up there? So it goes back to a little bit more of a design part. And then you get into the default of maybe applying to some places and hoping that you are selected as a candidate at those places. And so as a combination of both design and default, I was able to end up where I am at the firm that I'm with in New York City.
Great. Well, thanks for that recap. I think that paints a really good picture. Depending on how you look at it, it paints a good picture of the process. And obviously you did a great job setting yourself up for success, I think. And I'd love to hear, I think a lot of people would like to hear what your day-to-day looks like now. So where you're at in New York, we'd love to hear some of those.
Sure. So I think I'll speak specifically to my situation, but I'll zoom back to what an attorney's day might look like generally, and classify that in 2 buckets.
Great.
So broadly, you have 2 types of attorneys. You have litigators or you have transactional attorneys. And that's a wide spectrum, and you could have a lot of different variants of all of those and overlaps between those. But if you had to classify, litigators, as the name suggests, is people who go to court, litigate, are in an adversarial proceeding most of the time. That's not the case with me. I'm a transactional attorney. So if you think of an event happening, you can think of a transactional attorney working toward that event. So that might be the purchase of a company or some kind of deal that's supposed to close, or some kind of transaction that's supposed to take place. Uh, Versus a litigator, you can think of them as a retroactive type of attorney where they're looking back to an event that's occurred in the past, and they're litigating whether something, whether a certain party has a right or an obligation or an amount due or something like that. So those are the two main classifications, and in your day-to-day as an attorney can vary vastly depending on which bucket you fall in. So for myself as a transactional attorney, a lot of my day is centered around reviewing documents, and specifically contracts that lead up to that point in time that I described, whether that be a transaction of some kind, or a deal or purchase or sale, or some kind of contract that two parties want to enter into. So more specifically, I work for a firm that represents government entities for the most part on infrastructure related projects in different parts of the country. So you can think about that as anytime a city or a municipality wants to put together some kind of public good, whether that might be a transit system or a new terminal for an airport or a new arena, they need to figure out a way of entering into contracts with private parties to actually bring about those assets into their community. And so we help them put together contracts and think about how these facilities are going to be designed, constructed, operated, and maintained over an extended period of time, 30, 40, 50 years. And so that's sort of kind of what my day-to-day looks like, along with, as is typical of many professions, a lot of phone calls and client communication. That's routine and bread and butter of transactional lawyering.
Great, thank you. I do want to mention just briefly and interject here. So Suyash actually is writing, he wrote a blog post that will go live in a couple of weeks for the YoPro Know. And so his topic, I don't want to steal too much thunder from that.
Nope.
So you can be brief, but your role does consist of traveling, which is what he covers in that post. So if you wouldn't mind, kind of touching on that really briefly, what the traveling looks like for your role.
Sure, and obviously, we're speaking in a non-COVID situation, so under normal circumstances and however we define that moving forward, travel is a pretty essential part of my role. That's not always true for every single attorney. I have plenty of friends who are attorneys who travel a lot more than I do, and some who never travel. But I think travel is interesting, and I talk about that in the blog post that Camber is referring to, kind of the things that, the mindset that one needs to be, at least from my perspective, when you're traveling for work, and some tips around that. But for me, traveling has been mostly a positive thing. It's given me opportunities to meet some of my clients face to face, which in the digital conference call world, you don't always have to do that, but I've been fortunate to sit in a room and meet them, and I think that helps build some professional networking relationships that I think are vital. Absolutely. Yeah,
great, thank you for not going too much into detail, since people can
sure
read that
yeah.
later on. You mentioned COVID. Obviously we're in this COVID world. Can you talk about what that impact has looked like in your industry?
Yeah, sure. And I'll again speak to it broadly, and I'll give one example which I think will be kind of interesting to a lot of people who who have ever entered into a contract or signed a contract, which is all of us in some way, shape, or form. So obviously, not going to work is different and challenging in its own ways, because part of my job involves kind of collaborating with fellow attorneys, sitting in a room, whiteboarding things, talking around a conference table about different ideas and strategies that we might have. So that's been taken away, which I think is certainly a negative, but I think the industry as a whole has been well equipped to just take everything remote and perform all of our services remotely and efficiently. not unlike other industries, the legal industry has taken a hit financially. So there are a lot of law firms that are impacted negatively, that have had to cut salaries and things of that nature, just because there's not as much business that's happening. Exceptions would be bankruptcy lawyers, or insolvency restructuring lawyers, whose business is countercyclical. So, they're thriving, and a lot of firms are kind of being supported by some of those types of practices. And then one small specific point I'll make is that a lot of my time right now has been involved in researching and addressing something called act of God or force majeure clauses that are present in every single contract. And these are basically clauses which say, what is going to happen if something unforeseeable happens, and what each party's rights and obligations would be. And obviously this kind of falls into that category, the COVID situation. So that's sort of interesting in how, when you ask how is it impacting it, it's logistically, I think the implications are pretty obvious, but I think there's an interesting implication that, not a lot of people think about, and that I have to think about,
Right.
which is interesting.
I wouldn't think about that. But you're right. I mean, every industry is getting hit, but the point you made about, the counter cyclical effect that some companies are
Mm-hmm.
experiencing,
Mm-hmm.
that's interesting as well. So I think it's really great for a lot of people, like the way that this, there's some silver linings in everything, I think. But especially in this situation, like, you've been able to spend time with family again, and, be out of the city for a little while. And so I think there's definitely a lot of positives in this time period as well. But I am mindful of our time, so I want to wrap up with one final question, which
Yep.
is a little bit open-ended. I want to talk about, if there's anything else that you feel like you'd want to share with somebody either looking into this industry to get into law, or just any general young professional advice that you want to share.
Yeah, sure. So I'll try to answer those briefly in turn. For the first part of your question, like I said in my opening remarks, that you have to make a decision that can't be entirely by default. You can't get here by default. There has to be a design aspect to your strategy, in a very conscious decision to do this, because it's not only 3 years of your life in addition to your undergrad, but it's also the opportunity cost that you lose of income that you could otherwise earn. And unless you're financially fortunate to, your family might have money or something to cash flow law school, which mine did not. It's a serious long-term financial decision and investment that you're making as well. So I think that's the obvious monetary part, but depending on the type of law that you're doing, lawyers spend long hours working, and if you don't like what you're doing, I think you're better off doing something else which you enjoy more, especially given how much time we spend and the responsibility and reliance that our clients have on our advice and input. I think that's a consideration that shouldn't be lightly taken. And the final thing I'll say on that is, if you are really interested in that, seek out conversations with the people who are practicing law, and see if you can intern at a law firm in some capacity, or with a judge, or something like that, just because it's just so hard to make decisions in a vacuum. Maybe that can transition into the part B of your question, general advice. I think it's so hard to make decisions in a vacuum. So whatever career field one might be, I think just reaching out to people, grabbing a coffee, and gaining as much information as you can before you make a decision, and then not beating yourself up if maybe it's not what you thought it would be, because hindsight is always 20/20.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to end the interview, not only because it's just good advice, but it's something that I really think I found a few years ago when I was looking at jobs. Like, it's something that is really relatable to everyone, because at the end of the day, it's a lot about who you know, and it's a lot about those connections that you make that can help you, not only in a networking situation, but helping you determine what those future decisions are going to be. So I think that's some great words to end on. And I thank you for your time today, Suyash. Thanks for being on the YoPro Now.
Hey, thanks for having me.